on, folks? Welcome back to another episode of Nationalism, the Origins of the First World War. Johnny the Historian here. Professor Way. What did you say? And that's what I was going to be. I even had a lot of professors over in my university days that said I should be continuing in being a historian and a historical professor. So it's better than a lot of my high school teachers would ever said to me. So high school didn't really stimulate me as much as university did. There's a lot of unanswered questions in school, and I was just like, hey. But let's get into it, because we're going to get into something that I love to get into. Russian history. We're going to talk about the Russian Empire and how nationalism affected it and contributed towards the origins of the First World War. Now, a lot happened in Russia. We're going to start off with Nicholas I at this point, okay? Now, he decided that Polish nationalism could be only wiped out by destroying Polish culture. And that was the hardest thing. Because for the Russian Empire at this time, during the 1800s, the late 1800s, especially after their defeat in the Crimean War after 1856, it really showed the state of Russian affairs, not just on the international theater or the European stage, but also domestically. And this is where nationalism starts to take its hold, because they realized that Russia couldn't even militarily force to defeat. But you got to remember, Russia was taking on who in the Crimean War? Yeah, the Austrians, the French, the British, the Turks, and that one odd one that we talked about during the Italian unification, right? You see how it's all linked? Anywho's, as that happens, if you didn't see that episode, not my problem. You missed it, go back. Alright. But, the Kingdom of Sardinia. So, anyways, as it stands with the Russian Empire at this point, it's a massive entity. It's a vast empire, trying to orchestrate all of its different cultures and traditions and ethnicities and nationalities to keep it together. Now, it's going to change nationalism, and it's going to adapt it into a Russian way of doing it. Now, it's funny how it actually does this, because Russia does this very, very well. Very, very well. Russia being, besides, at this time, Russia was a vast empire, but it had serious weaknesses, especially political and economic backwardness. It was basically still had serfdom up until 1861 under Alexander II, which was his reign was 1855 to 1881. So during that time, because he had to wrap up the Crimean War and realized that he needed to modernize Russia a little bit towards the Western nations. Russia has always been trying to do and has fight with itself ever since, and it still does this on its own scale. It wants to keep its own identity as what it is to be Russian and what Russia stands for, but at the same time, it wants to have a mirror image of what it wants to be in the West. Well, history's going to repeat itself just a little bit here, all right? When it comes to Russia, it's a very, like a child just struggling to get her out of the candy store. Like, it's fighting its way. You know, it's fighting with itself alone when it's fighting with everyone else. But this is the story of Russia. And this is why Russia's a strong character in its people as well. And this is where everything starts to mimic what we see today. Now, after the November uprising, or the November Revolt in 1830, a lot of things started to happen, and that's where Russification comes into play. Russification becomes this massive, not just domestic or national or imperial policy, but throughout the entire domain, and even into the Balkans with Pan-Slavism, it started to happen because they kind of mix a little bit with there. But here we go. All right. So now with Alexander II, that was under Nicholas. Nicholas I ended it. Now in 1855, when Tsar Alexander III ascends to the throne, and becomes the next Romanov. He's faced with a lot of challenges. He's known as the Tsar the Liberator, all right? Because actually in 1861, the proclamation of the Serbs, the abolition to abolish serfdom within the Russian Empire. Now, it was great. It was in the Constitution. It was on paper, but it took many, many years and a couple generations to actually see the effects. It's like saying, yeah, we're going to end slavery, but not right yet. We're still going to have slaves for a while. All right? So it took a long transitional time, a couple generations for this to happen. But the thing is, it was a start. People keep forgetting that. It was a start. It was a glimmer of hope for the future. Might not be for that generation. It took a couple of generations. But because of that proclamation, and because that it was just on paper and not socially or politically in practice, is a catalyst towards the revolution, the Russian Revolution of 1917, and the rise of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, and the establishment of the world's first communist state. But, so what Russia decides to do at this point in time, now Alexander II actually decides to put this policy even straight forward with Russification. So he liberates the Slavs. Now, at the same time in Poland, he is crushing any sort of nationalism out of Polish society. Okay? In every way. He wants to replace Polish culture with Russian culture and Russian language. This is the part of the policy of Russification. So he's executing Polish soldiers. He's executing Polish leaders. He's imprisoning them. He's, torture and exile. Exile is just a little slower death and a little bit of misery towards death. All right? You'd rather be tortured than put to death and go to exile, tortured, and then put to death. So, pick your poison, I guess, on that aspect. Ouch, right? As people. So we got to remember. So he closed a lot of universities within the Polish region of the Russian Empire. He also replaced the Polish language within the government and the courts. Now, this would suck. If you're a Pole walking into the courts, the judge is there, he's speaking Russian to you, you have no idea what he is saying, because you only speak Polish. Chances are, no matter what happens, yeah, sure, there would have been an interpreter sometimes, but most of the times, well, you're still speaking Polish, so that's pretty much against the law, so yeah, we're going to send you to jail, bye. So, communication is one of the most key things in life. Language barrier, 100% in the courts, and government policies is like, how would anything get done? It was the Tower of Babel miniaturely established itself in Poland's government and its administrative courts. So for a bit, all right? So it was very hard that way to actually do that. But here's the thing, what Russia was doing, it backfired. The Poles became more filled and full of nationalistic fervor and spirit that they were like, see, we're being oppressed. We're being extinguished. We're being annihilated. We're trying to be what Russification is trying to do, assimilate other un-Russian languages and cultures into the Russian Empire. Now, this is superiority. At the same time that the Russian government and the Tsar is doing this, Russian identity starts to form. And Russian nationalism starts to happen. Russians start to feel part of an empire. Alright? Remember the Germans, where you had the Prussians wanted to be the dominant government and political and military power to rule over United Germany? Well, this is where Russia wanted to do this, is the Russians to rule over the entire nation of the Russian Empire, but the Russians are going to be the government, the leaders, the full shebang. It all mimics. It all has similarities. Remember the Austrian-Hungarian Empire forms? Well, when that actually forms in 1867, well, March the 30th, was it? No? No. So, when that actually formed, it was June. But anyway, it was June. So, when that actually formed, same idea. trying to keep them together but put them in the same name, two different parliaments, but an Austrian king. Well, there's a different forms that are happening throughout this age. Russia takes on a different form. A little bit of German, a little bit of the Austrians, and a little bit of the Italian unification concepts. So, this is how they're doing it. Now, the great thing about this is a stick comes out. Now, this is one of the minister Sergei Yurov's best formulas. He comes into a three-phrase thing. Orthodoxy, nationality, and what do you think the third one would be? Autocracy. Or autocracy, some people call it. The autocrat. Okay? So, this is the three rules. And this is extinguished in everything through society. It is publicized. It is pretty much propaganda. But it actually takes on its form. And this is what makes kind of what Russia is today. This is the origins of that, as much as this all contributes to the First World War and the establishment of the Russian nation we see today in Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation. Why Russia does what it does. Now, here's the thing about this. This formula was great because it actually, regardless if you're a Russian or un-Russian or a subject of the Russian Empire, you've seen, the idea was you've seen the Tsar's authority as the supreme and only authority. Absolute rule. Okay, absolutism. Alright? Autocracy, absolutism, anything like that. That was the other phrase, as you recall. Alright? Now, the other thing is, it goes to its spiritual identity as an Orthodox nation. And to being a protector, the Russians always considered, the Russian Empire always was the protector of the Orthodox world. The same as the Pope was the Catholic world. It's the same as the Americas, the protector of the free world. Alright? So you take on these personas. You take on these personalities as a nation. And Russia established that a very long time ago, especially after 1453, the fall of Constantinople and the kaput of the entire Byzantine Empire and transformed into the Ottomans. So, Russia really took on that status after that. And it still existed by this point. Still exists today. Alright? Church and state. In Russia, the Orthodox Church is hugely important to the Russian people and throughout the Russian Empire because it was majority Orthodox. Like, I'm talking 80, 90, 95% in most areas. Some places, 100%. Okay? So it got the church. And this united people in brotherhood of Christ. This is the reality. So, and the other thing was nationality. And the thing is nationality was the unity of the Russian people. And remember what we did a couple episodes ago, way back when we talked about the crumbs of nationalism throughout the ancient world. It wasn't quite nationalism, but it was kind of mimic nationalism, but it wasn't there. We talked about in those episodes. Well, we talked about the Roman Empire and its citizenship. Well, this is kind of Russia kind of actually does in a sense. It's almost like a forceful citizenship. You learn Russian, you learn its culture, its traditions, its religion, it's all the characteristics of nationalism. Russification. You're going to be a Russian citizen. This actually works. Even today in the Russian Federation, there is numerous ethnicities. There is numerous nationalities, but all start part of the Russian Federation. How it's set up. We're all different, but we are all united under one flag, one government, one land. This is where Mother Russia is born. The land we live on. It is our home, and we're fighting, all of us, regardless if you're Turk, regardless if you're Finn, regardless if you're Estonian, Ukrainian, or Pole. You're part of the Russian Empire. You're part within the borders. You are a Russian, and you're fighting for your homeland, which is Mother Russia. And this actually takes off. So, and a lot of it still existed, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because a lot of Russia today, in a sense, should be separated. Russia should be a lot smaller than it is. It didn't secede the whole picture, but it only shrunk a little bit to form the Russian Federation. So, keep that in mind. Now, so that all tends to happen, and the pillars of the state started to form, right? The idea that, this is what it's going to be. But this all takes place. So the Poles are starting to, yeah, they also do it towards the Ukrainians, also do it to the Baltic states, the three Baltic states that we talk about, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Lithuania sounds like some kind of mineral, doesn't it? Anybody? No? Okay. So, as of that, this is actually all happens. This is all going on in Russia at this time. This is how wicked Russia does this. I love how Russia does this. Now, it's very, everything's a little sketchy, right? Well, this becomes very, very sketchy. So, now the idea of the unity in the people. So, at the same time when Russification is happening, you get a development. Now, during this time, you have an explosion in Russian arts and music and literature. All right, everything in the arts field. You have a lot of famous authors starting to form. Crime and Punishment. Anybody read that book, and who's it by? Not gonna say. All right. Oh, The Swan. Compose, right? So I know these. The Nutcracker. Now, all these start to form in the 1800s, and Russia goes to experience its own. We've seen it in the German unification. We've seen it everywhere else up to this point. Russia does it extremely, all at once. And during this thing, it's developing its own culture, and it's looking at its own historical narrative. All right, and its own historical themes. This is where Russians start to look at themselves as more than just Russian. You're Russian, I'm Russian, we're all brothers in Christ of the Orthodox Church. We all live in this land. We are all one people. And it sticks. And guess what? It's still in Putin's Russia today, and it's more so now today than it ever was. And it gets more and more as every generation continues. All right? This is where it really establishes itself is in the 1800s, because Russians, a lot of people were actually assimilated and call themselves Russians. They look at it's like, I'm Canadian, but I have ancestry of French and English. But I don't go and say, hey, I'm Irish. I'm Canadian. Right? Same thing is going on in Russia. Right? Yeah, I'm Jewish, but I am Russian. Not Jewish Russian, I'm Russian. That's my own personal thing. I am Jewish. Not the national character aspect, right? So the personal concept. That's the great thing about Russification. But it didn't really work for the Poles, it didn't really work for the Ukrainians, but it worked for a lot of people that actually started to assimilate into the Russian Empire to hold it together even longer than it should have had. It should have fell by this point, especially after the Crimean War, especially after the 1880s. It should have fell apart, but it didn't. It's to hold it together. And those are the reasons why. Now, one thing about too with Russia is its expansion, imperial expansion. And it does it very well because nationalism, when Russia started to do this, and nationalism always, well, for the Russians, it was pretty much nationalism on steroids by this point. And expansionism started to become a very huge thing, especially among the Russian people. Because they thought themselves, like in Germany, the Prussians wanted the right. Well, same thing here. But the Russians were the inferiors over the rest of the un-Russian people, right? Within the borderlands, the geographical position of the Russian world. Well, the vast expanse of its empire. So, it kind of, its political ambition increased by this point. Russia thought to expand its territory in as much as its influence. And because it is incorporating other diverse peoples under Russian rule. Okay? And because of that, the downside of that, every action has a reaction. Downside of that, it increases tensions among those people, like the Poles and the Ukrainians, right? It was just never going to never happen that way. It was just going to be like that, right? But this is where Russia starts to establish. Now, the Poles start to have a lot of problems. The Romanians are also into the Russian sphere. The Ukrainians. Now, this all takes place and very potent when it comes up to the First World War. But Russia really established itself. But the thing is, when it ended serfdom, right? When it ended serfdom, it was kind of like, well, what do? Now, here's here's the thing. So, take the policies. Now, Tsar Alexander II really opened up new schools. He modernized the courts. He reformed the army. He did all these things within the Russian Empire. But at the same time, every action has a reaction. And Alexander III is like, we're stopping that. Because during that time, the Poles uprose. They had revolts, given a lot of hard times, a thorn in the Russian side. This was not really good. Now, within the Poles, though, the spirit of nationalism wasn't strong enough yet to overthrow the Russian domination. But the spirit wasn't really quite there. But it was. Now, despite all the policy changes and everything, all of these policy changes started to happen. Now, for the Poles, they're really the ones that are really going to be on the side. And all these policy changes did with the Russian people, and the Russians wanted to see themselves again. Alright? They desired what was in the West. It was like we always seen when, Alexander I marched into Paris with all those troops and took everything that they witnessed and experienced back to Russia. Forms of liberalism, constitution, absolute monarchy, that's out of the question. Right? Constitutional monarchy, absolutely, we can put together. Like, all these views came back. Ideas are more powerful than weapons. So, that's what tends to be, right? And Pan-Slavism, Russia was doing a lot in the Balkans and against the Ottoman Turks. When they went to their final war with expansionism, which was in 1877 to 1878 with the Russian-Ottoman War, which was one of the biggest wars and most fundamental to set up everything after the Crimean War, it really gained more Russian prestige. It seemed like Alexander's reforms were working, but not to the extent that it should have been. It wasn't like a decisive victory, or it was not that decisive. But you got to remember, the rest of the Western powers, like Britain and France, feared Russian expansion at the cost of the Ottoman Empire, and that's what Russia was hoping for. Now, when nationalism comes into fact, and you have Serbia, Romania, Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, you have all these countries becoming their own entities, then they're like, we want to expand our geographical position at the expanse of the Ottoman Empire. So, and Russia's like, shit, yeah, right? See the conundrum here? See the conundrum that can happen? So, and this actually does happen. So, despite that, and everything that all these reforms, and you think serfdom really wasn't on paper, it eventually developed the Will of the People organization, a terrorist organization, if you will, a revolutionary terrorist organization that came forth. So, it was kind of like, what do we do? How can we do this? Why should we do this? It just keeps going and going and going within the Russian Empire. But it had to keep it, the glue that it was using, it was very concrete, to keep itself together through ruthless means, but also reform means to modernize itself. It was very cautious. And a lot of the czars during this time, during the 1800s, was very cautious. It was back and forth. This one wants reform, not working. His son's going to be like, hard no. Right? And that's going to be Alexander III. But all this started to happen. Alright? But that's just a sum up of that. Now, the next episode we're going to talk about pretty much the Balkan Wars. And we're going to get into our next series, which is pretty much alliances, assassinations, and crises. How did all those in the 1800s contribute to the origins of the First World War? Now, I don't know if anybody's watching, or if you're looking at these, but if you do watch, please comment. I don't need you to describe. It's all over. It's your free will. And so far, you guys are using free will pretty conveniently, I would say, because I have no comments or nothing like that on a lot of this. Online, outside of online, yes, but not really. So I need you to help me out here. Eventually, I'm going to get the software and everything to have really wicked, TikTok kind of concept videos, and do real-like videos, with pictures. I got all that together. I just don't have the programming or the time right now. And probably not for a bit. But because of that, episodes go slower. But anyways, you know how it goes, right? Now, one thing about the Russian Empire, and I love Russian history because this is very interesting. There's a lot going on at this point, but we have a short time, and we're only talking about the basis of nationalism in its effects in the East. But it really sets the stage because Pan-Slavism and Russification set the stage for the origins of the First World War. And now, we're going to get into more of that in the next episode. But until the next episode, and the episode we're going to talk about is the Balkan Wars. And we're going to look into that very much a lot because the Balkan Wars is awesome. We're going to look at a pretty review over that. And that would be the last episode of the effects of nationalism towards the origins of the First World War, the war to end all wars, the Great War. Alright? Depends how you want to call it. But then we'll get into a recap for an episode or two of talking and reviewing over all the episodes and how it is linked, and even to the modern day of what goes on in this part of the world, Europe and the Balkans and Russia today, and what's going on even in the Middle East, because this actually has the effects of the Ottoman Empire and what was pretty much nationalism, because the Kurds are one of those groups. So, figure all that out next time. But until next time, know your history, make sure you get your facts right, and don't argue history with a libtard.